All right, so welcome everybody to the Tensor tutorial. This is being taught by myself, Gray Ballard, Danny Dunleavy, and I think this might be the only tutorial with a Genius bar, staffed by Jeremy Myers and Brett Larson, newly Dr. Larson. All right, so how this is going to be structured is we're going to have a little bit of lecture, and then we're going to have a little bit of lab. And so we're going to kind of go back and forth. And if you do not have a computer to run the lab, or you don't want to install MATLAB today, you can just find a friend and shoulder surf. And if you can't find a friend and shoulder surf, we can actually run it in a breakout room on Zoom. So just you can post a message in Zoom, or otherwise just let us or our Genius bar know, and we will get you situated. So the big thing you need to start downloading now, if you haven't already done it, is this is a file that we're going to compress, but it's 142 megabytes. It will download in time if you start now. Otherwise, you're going to shoulder surf for that one. And then everything else you want to download too, it's relatively small. So if you go to this website, you can get to that. One place where you have everything is if you go to OneDrive. So there's a link at the bottom. It's basically like Google Drive. It has all the files you need. You can just go pull those directly from there. All right, so that's logistics, except for those who are just coming in, you've got to sit in the first 4 rows, and you get the benefit of a power cord for the laboratories. Okay, so welcome. First, I'm just going to start off by just giving you basics of tensor decomposition. So when I talk about a tensor, I'm talking about a D-way array. So a vector is a tensor of order 1. A matrix is a tensor of order 2. When you get to 3 ways or higher, then you're talking about something called a higher order tensor. And then much of the mathematics gets very, very interesting. And so here we have a picture of an m by n by p tensor. When you get to higher orders, it's a little harder to draw, but my friend at Deep AI Text to Image created this lovely rendering of a higher order tensor for us to enjoy. So just to sort of ground things, I just want to show you, like, here's a 2 by 2 by 2 tensor, and it's indexed by 3 values, so like an I, J, K indexing. The I index goes up and down. So the first index is up and down. The second index is left and right. The third index is into the board. And for 4 indexes, I didn't ask text to image to draw that one for me, but you can use your imagination. So in this little example here, the element 6, its position is 1 down, 1 left and right, and 2 back. So that's the 1, 1, 2 element. That just gives you an idea of how we are indexing into our tensor. And so this is kind of easy to do on a computer. You can think of having arrays with 3 indices, not a problem. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the mathematics of that. So tensors are fairly ubiquitous in applications. As folks learn about tensors, they suddenly realize that they too have tensors in their applications. So we keep hearing of more and more examples every day. We're going to try and have you actually work with some real data during this tutorial. So our hope is we get you hands-on decomposing tensors. And so I think, yeah, we have all these data sets in your labs today. One is a large-scale simulation data set that is a 3D grid of data and a density measurement at each point in the grid. So this is something like you might get out of scientific simulation data. We have some data from chemistry, fluorescence data. We'll talk about that more later. We have discrete data, Chicago crime patterns. So where are crimes happening in the city and when and what types of crimes. And then we have data from neuroscience, a collection of the neural activity of a monkey performing a task using a brain-machine interface. These are just a few examples and ones that you'll be able to get your hands on in this tutorial. So just to give a little bit about indexing and sort of referring to things in a tensor that we'll use here in this tutorial, you can look at a three-way tensor, you can think, well, that's just a stack of matrices, and you'd be right. So you can look at what we call the horizontal slices of a three-way array. So these are where you fix the first index I, and then you get these slices that are stacked like pizza boxes. If you turn those pizza boxes on the side, you get the lateral slices. This is fixing the second index, gives you one of those sideways pizza boxes. And then the frontal slices are one in front of the other. And if you were to type out a tensor in MATLAB, it will show you the frontal slices one at a time. So when we work with tensors, we often are interested in what we call the fibers of the tensor. And these are the higher order analogs of rows and columns. So they are always vectors. And you get a fiber when you hold every index fixed except for one. And so if you hold the second and third index fixed and you just vary the first, you get what we call column fibers. So those are just like columns of a matrix, but now you also have them into the board. If you fix all the indices but the second, you get row fibers. If you fix all the indices but the third, you get tube fibers. And so you look at different perspectives. In matrices, you think about what is the space of the span of the rows, what is the space of the span of the columns. We're going to think about similar things with tensors, and we're going to deal with these one-dimensional pieces, which we call fibers. So these are alternatively called mode K fibers. So the columns are mode 1 fibers, the row fibers are mode 2s, and the tube fibers are mode 3. And that way, if we have more than 4 dimensions, we don't have to come up with names for all of them, because I don't think there's a name for the fourth mode fibers, but we could come up with one. One of the things that we use fibers for is, I told you tensors are so great, let's do everything with tensors. But the first thing we do in many of our algorithms is we take that tensor and we put it right back to a matrix, because that's what we know how to compute with. And one of the main ways we do that is something called a mode K unfolding, where we take all those fibers and arrange them as the columns of the matrix. So I want to stress that this is exactly the same numbers. And we've just taken them and put them into a different shape. So before you had a 3D shape, now we're just going to have them a 2D shape, but it's the same number of values and the same actual values. So if we do the mode 1 unfolding, it takes all these up and down fibers and just creates them as the columns of the matrix. You can do also this mode 2 unfolding. This is a little trickier. So the 0, 0 element of the tensor maps to the 0, 0 element here. So it's kind of like you take it and you kind of flip it around and shove it over there. These details don't really matter because MATLAB is going to make this all painless for you, but it's more conceptual. Just know that you put these into the columns of a matrix. And then mode 3, it's taking those tube fibers, we turn them, and we put them into the columns of this matrix. Today, what we're going to talk about is 2 main tensor decompositions that find a lot of utility. One is called the Tucker decomposition. It has other names, such as multilinear decomposition. Sometimes it's also known as higher order SVD, though technically that's an algorithm, but colloquially people often call it that. And that is often useful for compression of data. And so that's why you're going to have to download this big data set, and then you get to make it smaller. Another thing we'll talk about is generalized CP decomposition, and that's going to decompose things as the sum of outer products of vectors. This is also known as canonical decomposition or candecomp, and also parallel factors or parafec. It's a decomposition of many names. And we'll also in the last part talk about a generalized version of that. There are many things that we are not discussing. Tensor train is one that's very popular, also tensor ring. There's TSVD, there's parafac2, there's block CP, and probably some other really important decompositions that I forgot to mention. We only have 2 hours, so hopefully this will give you a little taste of what is to come. So just again, for those of you who weren't here at the beginning, you're going to want to start downloading the materials at this URL now, and I'm going to hand the floor over to Gray.
So here's the picture of the Tucker format tensor or Tucker decomposition. So I'm thinking of, on the left is like my data tensor. So I'm thinking it's a dense tensor, it's M by N by P. And with a Tucker decomposition, I want to approximate this thing with a Tucker format tensor. So on the right, I've got a Tucker format tensor. And so Tucker format consists of what we call a core tensor. So we use G for that. And this is a tensor with as many modes as the data tensor on the left. But the dimensions in each mode we want to be smaller. Okay, so we have a smaller core tensor as part of our Tucker format, but then we also have a factor matrix for each mode. So in this case, I have 3 factor matrices and 1 core tensor. Okay, and so the idea is that if I multiply these factors together in the right way, I get a good approximation of this original data tensor. Okay, so how do you multiply these things together? Well, I've written it element-wise here. And so it's this triply nested summation where I take an element of the core and then an element from each of the factor matrices, multiply these things together, add them up, and that gives me an approximation of a particular entry of my data tensor. So I'll use X for data tensor. T is the Tucker format tensor that's represented by the core and factor matrices. And we'll also use tensor decomposition and tensor approximation interchangeably. So really, this T is an exact Tucker format tensor. The X is approximated by the Tucker format tensor T. Okay, so that's the idea. This takes a lot of symbols to write. I can write the Tucker format much more succinctly using tensor notation, but I have to use a new weird multiplication here. So this is a times symbol with a subscript. This is what we call a tensor times matrix operation. So let me tell you what that is next. Okay, so this tensor times matrix or TTM operation, it's mode specific. Okay, so in this example, I'm thinking of multiplying in the first mode. So I'm doing a tensor times a matrix, and I'm doing it in the first mode. So what this corresponds to is really taking this matrix and applying it to all of my mode 1 fibers in the input tensor. Okay, so I take my matrix U and I do a matrix vector product with each of the fibers. My output is also a vector, and those become the mode 1 fibers in my output. Okay, so matrix times a bunch of vectors kind of sounds like matrix multiplication, and that's because it is. So what I can do is if I just reshape my tensor by unfolding it as Tammy described, so this is the mode 1 unfolding where the mode 1 fibers are stacked as columns in this matrix, then my operation is exactly matrix multiply. I take the matrix U, I multiply times the unfolded matrix X in the first mode, and that gives me the unfolded matrix Y in the first mode. Okay, so TTM is really just matrix multiply, but the mode that we specify is sort of the direction that we do the multiplication. Okay, so that's one TTM. The Tucker format at the bottom right here is actually TTM in each of the 3 modes. What you do is you do one TTM at a time, and the order doesn't matter. So mathematically, you can do them in any order. So we don't have any notation to say in what order to do this. You can choose. Okay, but after you do those TTMs, you have an explicit representation of your Tucker format tensor. Okay, so that's the idea of a Tucker decomposition. As Tammy mentioned, the reason that we like the Tucker decomposition is because it gives us compression, and we've seen really effective compression for multi-dimensional data. So just to give you a sense of how it works. Okay, so my original data is M by N by P, and then my core tensor, I'm going to say it has dimensions Q by R by S. These are often called the ranks. And so when Q is smaller than M and R is smaller than N and S is smaller than P, then we can compress in all the modes. And so if we want to know how much compression are we getting, then we can look at the ratio between the number of entries in my original data and then the number of entries in my Tucker format representation. So Q times R times S is the number of entries in my core tensor, and then these terms are the number of entries in my factor matrices. Usually, the number of entries in the core tensor dominates. This is especially true when you get to higher order tensors. So we often just approximate this ratio with the number of entries in the original tensor divided by the number of entries in the core, and we sort of ignore the factor matrices. Okay, so that's the main application of Tucker. I want to highlight that Tucker format is not unique, and so we generally don't use Tucker for interpretation, or if we do it very carefully. The basic reason is the factor matrices that we get, those columns, they form a basis of a subspace for that mode. And that subspace is important, but the basis we use to represent it is not. And any basis will do. And so that's why you get some non-uniqueness. Okay, so we're not going to look at the entries in the factor matrices and try to interpret meaning out of them because they're arbitrary to some extent. Okay, so all right, so that's our goal to get compression of multidimensional data. So how do we pick the ranks? How do we figure out, what is the shape of the Tucker format tensor we get? And so it's a trade-off of compression and accuracy. And so there's actually a couple of ways that people like to formulate the optimization problem of how to compute it. So one way is to say, okay, let me specify the size of my Tucker format, the size of my core or my ranks, Q, R, and S. So I'm going to specify that. And then given that size, I know how many parameters are in my model. Let me just try to find the most accurate representation I can. So I minimize the approximation error subject to the ranks being fixed. Okay, so that's one way to do it. So this makes sense, maybe you have a memory budget. And so this is all I can afford memory-wise, so let me just get the most accurate that I can. Often it's unclear exactly how to pick Q, R, and S because there's lots of ways to fit the memory budget. So it's not always easy to do. Another scenario may be that, well, I know how much error I'm willing to tolerate. So I know I'm going to get an approximation and I need it to be at least this accurate. And so let me just get the highest compression I can. So let me just find the smallest Tucker format tensor that satisfies my error threshold. And so one way to formulate that is, let me minimize the number of entries in my core tensor subject to my Tucker format being an accurate representation of my data, subject to the relative error of my approximation being below my threshold. Okay, so either way is a reasonable way to seek out a good Tucker decomposition. Okay, so how do you compute this thing? So there are different ways. The optimization problem here is the one where we fix the ranks. So this optimization problem, it's nonlinear, non-convex. We can't always solve it to the global optimum and get that guarantee. So it's a hard problem, but for the Tucker format, we can actually guarantee that we can get really close to the optimal solution. So we can find what are called quasi-optimal solutions. And what that means is the solution that our algorithms find, we can't guarantee that it's the best, but we can guarantee that it is within a square root of the number of modes within the best approximation error. Okay, so in this example, I've got 3 modes. The square root of 3 is very small. So we can get within 70% of the optimal solution, which is more than I usually ask for. Okay, so our solutions can be very good. This doesn't happen for many tensor problems. We'll see with CP, we don't have these kinds of guarantees. So this is really nice for the Tucker problem. Okay, so there's multiple algorithms. Some are direct, so they have a fixed sequence of steps. Some of them are iterative, but all of them sort of depend on the matrix SVD and then also the TTM operation that I told you about. So on the right, I'm just giving you one example. This is maybe the simplest algorithm, and it does really well. So it's a direct algorithm. It just has 4 steps if you have 3-way data. And basically, if you remember the unfoldings, you consider each mode-wise unfolding, and you do the SVD. And here I'm specifying the ranks of the Tucker format that I want. You just keep that many left singular vectors. So I take the first Q left singular vectors of the SVD of the first unfolding, the first R of the second, and the first S of the third, and that gives me my factor matrices U, V, and W. To get the core, I do this multiple TTM operation with the transposes of the factor matrices and compute my core. And then I'm done. So that's the end of my algorithm. And the Tucker format tensor I get from this is quasi-optimal. So it's really close to the best Tucker format tensor with these ranks that you could possibly get. Okay, so that's one way to compute it. There are others. You won't have to think about these algorithms in the lab. You'll just use the existing method in the tensor toolbox. Okay, so just to give you an example of some really large scale data that we've considered, and I'll show you some results here, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the data that you'll work with. Okay, so in this example, we're taking scientific stimulation data. So this is data from simulating combustion engines. So it's a code called S3D out of Sandia. And so what's happening is they have a simulation in 3 spatial dimensions. So they've got a 3D spatial grid. They're tracking a bunch of variables. So this is things like temperature and velocity, also the chemical composition, so how much oxygen or carbon or nitrogen is in a grid point, and then they're simulating through time. And they're doing this simulation on a supercomputer. So the grid sizes they use can be reasonably large, so like 500 by 500 by 500 in space, hundreds of time steps, tens of variables. They're generating a lot of data. So the simulations are very efficient. So they run in reasonable time, but the data they generate is huge. So with these examples, already we're in the terabytes of data. So after they run their simulation, it's very accurate. They get their answer. They got to figure out what to do with all this data, and it's a hassle. So often they just haphazardly downsample. Let me just try to write out every 10th time step, or let me downsample in some other way. And so our solution to this is to use Tucker compression to be more principled and to keep an approximation that has a much smaller memory footprint than these terabytes of data. Okay, so what we found is that the Tucker decomposition works really well for this type of data. So we looked at a particular data set. It's called stats planar. So it has dimensions that are similar to what I showed you in the previous slide, so terabytes in size. And so they were writing this stuff to disk, and so we were reading it from disk to try to process it. Ideally, we would not have to deal with the file system. But just to read it into memory, we needed 250 nodes. Okay, so we had to use parallel I/O, read it in from disk, which took a long time. It was an order of minutes. But we wrote parallel software that implemented some of these methods for computing Tucker, so that we could do it on this large data set. And so we computed with 2 different approximation errors. So we said we're willing to tolerate this much error, and we use 2 different parameters. So we use 1e minus 4 and 1e minus 2. So 1e minus 4 is a more accurate representation than 1e minus 2. And then we got the smallest cores that we could find with our algorithm. And so the core dimensions are listed here. And so if you look at the memory footprint for these, we get down to gigabytes in the case of the accurate approximation. And so that means we're changing terabytes into gigabytes. This is like 2 orders of magnitude compression. So now this is something that fits on a laptop, for example. And we can compute it on the order of seconds. And writing this out to disk is on the order of tens of seconds rather than minutes. And then if you're willing to tolerate sort of more error, so less accurate approximation, so 1e minus 2 error, the core dimensions get smaller. Memory footprint is now in the megabytes. So that means the compression ratio is 5 orders of magnitude. It takes a little less time to compute and then a lot less time to write to disk. And handling data set the size of megabytes, you don't have to download early for the tutorial. That's easy to get and manipulate. And so what we found is that these approximation errors were good enough for a lot of the downstream science. So especially if all they want to do is visualize, then the accuracy doesn't need to be so high. So here's a visualization of the temperature, sort of an ISO surface, so you can see the sort of edge of the flame in the combustion. And I can't tell any difference in these visualizations, even for the sort of high accuracy or a high error approximation. Okay, so this we get really high compression, and then if visualization is all you want to do, then you can't even tell the difference. Okay, so that's a really big data set. We didn't ask you to download that. So I'm going to give you a much smaller data set to work with. But before I do, I just want to highlight, in order to do this visualization, you have to take the Tucker format and then reconstruct the pieces that you want. So one way to do it is to fully reconstruct. So start from the Tucker format and then do the TTMs to piece together the full representation, which is the approximation of the original data. Okay, so this is sort of the decompression step of the entire data set. So if you do that, in each step, you do a TTM and the data gets bigger and bigger until you get the full representation. But if all you want to do is that visualization of the temperature isosurface, you don't need to form the entire reconstruction in the beginning. So if all you care about is a particular piece of the output, say a subtensor, or maybe you want to do some downsampling in a particular mode, you can think about this as multiplying, say, for example, a selector matrix times your tensor. So this matrix just has a few ones in it to tell me what slices of the tensor I want to get because I'm interested in this subtensor. Okay, so I can treat this like a TTM actually, to multiply the selector matrix times the tensor. But if I have my tensor in Tucker format, I don't need to form the full reconstruction first. I can take advantage of the format that Tucker gives me. So if I do this TTM with a selector matrix, I can actually apply it only to the factor matrix in that mode and get something really small. And so then I go through the other steps of the TTMs, and you can see that the stuff in green grows, but it never gets bigger than what I want to reconstruct. I never form this full format tensor. I just deal with small stuff. And so this is a lot more efficient, both in terms of memory and computation. Okay, so I'll give you a chance in the lab to play with this partial reconstruction and see how much faster it is. But it's a nice feature of Tucker format compression. It's not true of all compression techniques. So it's a nice part is because of the multilinear structure within our Tucker format tensors. Okay, so I want to get to the Miranda data set. So as Tammy mentioned, this is tracking the density of a simulation. So it's three-dimensional, it's a fixed time step. And it's 384 by 384 by 256. And so what starts with sort of heavy fluid on top and less heavy fluid on bottom. And then they start the simulation and then they start to mix. Okay, so one visualization of it is to take these horizontal slices, and on the left and sort of near the bottom, it's the less dense fluid, and on the right, the yellow is the more dense fluid, and you can sort of see in the middle how they're mixing together. So I'll give you a chance to manipulate and generate these images. So I did really high compression, so you can see some artifacts of the reconstruction. The compression you do will be a little bit more
Hey,
accurate.
Gray, can you get them going in like less than 60 seconds?
Yep, so I'm ready to get them going now. Okay, so here's the overview of the lab. So you can find it at the website, which I think you've already gotten to. And I'll give you a chance to work with both artificial data and the Miranda density data set.
So the CP tensor decomposition is, as I mentioned before, also known as parallel factors or canonical decomposition. It dates back to Hitchcock in 1927. Among other things, Hitchcock was the thesis advisor for Claude Shannon. It was reinvented many times, but twice in 1970 by Carolyn Chang at Bell Labs and by Richard Harshman, I think it was at UCLA at the time. So you have some bunch of data in your tensor, and you're going to build a model, which is really what you're going to find is three matrices. So in this case, you're going from 3D data to three pieces of 2D data. If it was a 4D tensor, you'd go to 4 pieces of 2D data. So this is already sort of a style of compression, but it has it's more useful often for interpretation because we can't necessarily control the error that easily. What you do with those 3 matrices that you find is you take matched outer products of the columns. So what I'm showing here is the first column of A, outer product with the first column of B, outer product with the first column of C. The mathematics of this is not so important that you get it in this next few minutes. I do show you the formula here. The IJK entry of the model is equal to this funny looking sum. And what this says is you take row I of the matrix A, row J of the matrix B, and row K of the matrix C. You element-wise multiply those 3 rows together, and then you sum that up. And that gives you IJK entry, and you do that for every entry. And that's how your model that's how you create your model, which is an approximation of your data. We call this a multilinear model. And so once we have this structure, then you might ask the question, how do I compute this? It's an optimization problem. So I want to find the model that gives me the lowest sum of squared error across all possible models. Did I see a hand raised? No. And I forgot to mention on this one, so we have to choose here a model rank R, which is the number of columns in each of these matrices. And in contrast to Tucker, this rank is the same across all factor matrices. So they all have the same number of columns. That's because we have to match them up to do these outer products. So this is our CP model. So we're going to cast that as an optimization problem. There's 2 main methods for solving it. The first one is alternating least squares. There's many ways to present this. I'll try to give one that doesn't involve too much tensor notation. So if I write out that problem, and I'm just filling in here what the model MIJK entry is, and I'm going to alternate. I'm going to fix B and C and solve only for A. So let's just consider that problem, and then I'll fix others and solve for the other variables. So if I'm just solving for this variable A, and if I stare at that a while, first thing I notice is the rows of A are independent of one another, so I can solve for them separately, so I can move the summation outside. And secondly, each of these problems, if I kind of ignore that B and C are two different things, I can just multiply them together. And it's a little funny that I have these JK indices, but I could actually combine that into one indice that goes from 1 to n times p. And then maybe hopefully if you stare at it and squint, you can see, oh, that's just a least squares problem. And we're really good at solving least squares problems in data science. This is a linear least squares problem. We can solve it with a closed form solution. So that's how we get to this CP alternating least squares method. And so I just showed you how to solve sort of for A when you fix B and C. And so what do you do with that? Well, that gives you a new A. Then you fix A and C, solve for B. Then you fix A and B, solve for C, and then you keep looping until you reach some sort of convergence. And so we like this method because each subproblem that we have to solve here is a convex subproblem with a closed form solution. Not only that, it actually has special structure that makes it just a little bit cheaper than a normal least squares problem. And so this makes it a really hard method to beat. And this method was in those original 1970 papers in both of them, and it continues to be sort of the method to beat to this day. There are some limitations though. You can add non-negativity constraints to least squares, but now it's no longer an easy closed form problem. And it's even more challenging to deal with things like missing data, symmetries, like if you want A to be equal to B, regularization, or using other loss functions, which you'll hear about in the last part of the tutorial. So an alternative to the CP alternating least squares is what we call CP opt. So here we're just going to treat this as a direct optimization problem. So even though we have matrices A, B, and C, they're just variables. So we just have a bunch of letters, you know, A11, A12. These are just variables that we have to solve for. And so we can just stack them all up and think of them as a matrix U, sort of from an optimization, a vector U from an optimization point of view. We just take vec A, stack it on top of vec B, on top of vec C. And now we have a vector of unknowns, which is R, which is the number of columns per matrix, times n plus p. That's basically all the unknowns in A, B, and C. And then, but we're still optimizing the same thing, and we can work out the gradient. I'm just going to kind of like give you a very high level view. I'm just going to say there are gradients. We kind of get them through a chain rule. So we take the derivative of something squared, so then it's like 2 times that thing, and then we apply the chain rule, and we take the derivative of the inside, then it gets a little funny. But we can get a derivative with respect to A, that is the unfolding of this sort of derivative tensor in mode 1 times this magical thing called a Cauchy-Rel product, which I'm not even going to define for you today, but it just involves the matrices C and B. And we can do similarly for the derivative of B and the derivative with respect to C, and we just kind of have different unfoldings of this G, sort of gradient tensor, and then the chain rule gives us those other couple of matrices that we have to multiply in. You should totally, study this deeply, but today you don't actually have to know. You just have to know there is a gradient, and it's not too hard to compute, and it uses something that you might have heard people refer to if you've gone to talks called the MTTKRP, or the matricized tensor times Cauchy-Rel product, which just means I take a matricized tensor, in this case G, and then times this magical thing, which is called a Cauchy-Rel product. And so this is a little bit more flexible in some ways. So we're just going to optimize this problem. If I have a way to evaluate the function, I have a way to evaluate the gradients, I can use my favorite off-the-shelf solver, like limited memory BFGS, or some momentum methods that have become very popular lately. And I should also say in Tensor Lab, which is another MATLAB tensor toolbox, they have Gauss-Newton methods as well, and they actually go ahead and compute the Jacobian, and then you get faster convergence, but slower iterations. The nice thing about these optimization approaches is that it's much easier to incorporate constraints and missing data and symmetries and regularization and other loss functions, as we'll see in the next part. It has the same challenges as before. Even with ALS, you are ultimately solving a non-convex optimization problem. With ALS, the subproblems were convex, but the overall problem was still non-convex. And then with the optimization formulation in particular, and I mentioned this mainly if you go and implement this yourself, there's a scaling ambiguity. And so there are ways to fix that with regularization, which is something to like remember when you start implementing it and you go like, what's going wrong? You're not gonna implement it today, don't worry. If you're wondering what's going wrong, sometimes it's the scaling ambiguity coming to bite you. One of the questions that comes up a lot and which we don't have a great answer for, could be a good research topic, is how to choose how many of those rank 1 outer products you should have. We call this the rank. So it's the number of columns in the matrices. And there's basically a bunch of heuristics that have been proposed. And sort of one that people generally use is you compute your CP for several different ranks, and then you kind of look for when it stops improving significantly. So we're at a data science conference, we do a lot with machine learning. As you increase the number of parameters in your model, you should get lower error because you have more parameters. And so you will see that here. But eventually that improvement is really just capturing noise, and so it kind of slows down. And so the magic is figuring out that right point. So in this example here, if I did rank 1, I have 45% error, rank 2 has 13% error, rank 3 has around 3% error. When I go to rank 4, it's still around 3% error. So we'll call 3 the best rank. It's often a little more nuanced than that, and sometimes you just play around, and there are other proposals out there for how to choose the rank, but this is maybe something that we'll have you play with a bit with today. And I will note, because it's a non-convex optimization problem, if you just run it once, you might not actually find the minimizer. So maybe you want to run it 2-3 times to have a better feeling that you're converging to the best minimum. So normally I run it like 3 to 5 times, take the best minimizer, and then plot that. My last few minutes, I'll talk about handling missing data. We call that CP WOPT. W is like for weighted optimization. And so one of the nice things about the optimization formulation is we can just say, hey, I only know some of the entries, so why should I take the least sum of squared errors over entries I don't know? It just doesn't make sense. So if we define this thing omega here in red as just my indices of known entries, I'll just change the objective function to only sum over the entries that I know and ignore everything else. And then it just changes the gradient ever so slightly. This weird G tensor I compute, I just zero out everything I don't know. So that W tensor that I element-wise multiply in, that's what that star means. I put a 1 for entries I know and a 0 for entries I don't know, and that's the only thing that changes in the gradient. Changes a lot of other things in terms of computational efficiency, so that's a more advanced topic than we'll talk about today, but it's easy, relatively easy to do mathematically. The labs that you'll work on here, we're going to do 2 different data sets. The first is a real data set in fluorescence spectroscopy. And so what we do is we take some samples. So we've been all doing little samples of stuff with our COVID testing, but you might take samples from around a lake to test the water quality, and then try to see what chemical compounds are in there to make sure that everything is okay. And you can measure multiple samples from different places and get slightly different profiles from each. So what you're going to get is data that is data measured at 251 emissions, 21 excitations, and then we have 18 different samples. So we'll put that into a tensor and you have that. And that's the tensor data EEM is where that data is located, and we have a lot more details if you go to that GitHub about like where this data came from and how it was pre-processed. That one thing that we did in pre-processing it is fill in missing data. And I'm going to let you actually play with the missing data too if you have time today. You can go in and play with that missing data and see if you can solve the problem even when the data is missing and still do the decomposition of it. And you're also going to spend some time trying to interpret what you get out, which is going to be fun. And that's sort of the hardest part of CP decomposition. It's really fun to compute them, but then most of our scientists who are going to then take our data analysis and use it would like to understand what we just gave them. So we'll provide you with some tools so that you can sort of visualize the outputs. The other data set we have is data collected at Stanford of a monkey controlling a mouse cursor using a brain-machine interface. And so what they do is they light up a target, the cursor starts in the middle, and then the monkey should just use the brain, and it fires the neurons, and this is recorded by this device, and it moves the cursor. And so what we have as data is the activity of 52 neurons, and then we've sort of discretized this data over 200 time steps. The first 100, it's moving to the target. We've sort of time warped it, so it takes all the same for everyone. And then the second 100, it's actually holding it at the target because it has to hold it there to get the reward. And this is over 88 trials and spread out over 4 different targets. And so this is actually the real traces of the movements that the cursor made. But what you're going to have is the neurons and basically how much they activated at each step, and then the 88 trials. And there's a lot more about this data and how it was processed at the website listed there. I'm just going to flash up these references just to tell you they're in the PDF. You can go back and look at these. This is for some of the math and a lot for the data sets. And then we'll skip to the lab. So in this lab, you're going to play with that EEM data set. You're going to explore the data. You're going to try and figure out the rank for what's the best rank to use if you're using that CP. And then you're going to run CP for the best rank and look at it. You're going to add non-negativity constraints. And you're also going to play around, like if you pick the wrong rank, what would happen? And then if there's time, there's a couple extra labs, one on that monkey data set, where you're going to, again, look a little bit at your data, compute a non-negative CP on that data, visualize the results, and even use the outputs of CP as inputs for clustering and see how that goes. And then also the other bonus you can do, you don't have to do them in this order, is to use that first data set, but actually the original raw data, which has missing entries, and see if you can do CP on that. And how am I doing on time? Yep, I'm going to go ahead and start the next lab now. There is some extra slides on there that go ahead and try to visualize CP and give you a sense of what it does. And the only other thing I'll say that I didn't say from those slides is that CP, one of the neat things about it compared to matrix factorization is that under very mild circumstances, like the factor matrices being full rank, you have a unique decomposition. So oftentimes is helpful for interpretation and solves some of the problems of non-uniqueness that we encounter in matrix factorization. And in particular in the submission fluorescence data, mission excitation fluorescence data, that's why they actually like to have multiple samples, because they're much more likely to get a good solution than if they just apply matrix factorization. With that, I will turn you over to lab 2.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to the next section, our last section, on generalizing the CP model that Tammy had described. How's everybody doing? Can I get a heads? Yeah, thumbs up? Everybody's doing okay? All right. Yeah, I don't know if I want to see the hands for that, but I'm Danny Dunleavy. I'm going to be talking about the generalized CP models. Just as a reminder, you can go to this tiny URL. One thing that might not have been mentioned is that if you haven't already, the MD files have the lab, but the .m files that are the same name with the word solutions by it will also give you hints on and the actual solutions for each of the labs. So if you're stuck, you want to do it on your own, and you're not getting the help, you can go to those solution files and find the answers there. Okay, I'm going to start by talking about CP by revisiting what Tammy had talked about, and then start to extend it from where she left off. So this is the data and model description that Tammy had brought up for the CP model. And we want to look at this model where we have a fit between model and data per entry, and then a sum over the squares of the differences of those entries between the model and the data. And so we see that this is a specific form of our goodness of fit function that we're going to use in our minimization problem. And that has some specific meaning in a statistical sense, and we'll get to that in a second. But there's nothing holding us back at this point from what Tammy had talked about in extending this idea from this functional form of a loss function to something more general, a generalized loss function that's just taking our elements of the data and the elements of our model and computing some loss function associated with it. And this opens up the avenue to look at different data types, look at different assumptions on your data, account for something that you might know ahead of time about the structure of your data. This specifically leads to us to a method called GCP, or Generalized CP Tensor Decomposition, that Tammy and David Hong, who's here as well up in the front, and Jed Dersh developed several years ago. In the MATLAB Tensor Toolbox, if I refer to GCP opt or GCP_opt, that's what I'm talking about. It's the implementation in the MATLAB Toolbox associated with this method. Okay, so if we wanted to move to a specific form, I'm going to give you an example of looking at data that has a Poisson distribution and looking at the relationship between the data and the model using an identity link. So if we assume that our data is coming from a Poisson distribution where the data parameters for that Poisson distribution come from our model, it would look something like this, where each entry xi is distributed or sampled from a Poisson distribution with parameter m sub I. And you can see that this has very characteristic distributions associated with whatever those parameter values are. So a few here, m equals to 1, m equals to 4, m equals to 10. You see a different distribution than you would have with our previous least squares fit, and which was assuming a Gaussian distribution. But this probability mass function presented here, if we wanted to actually solve this problem from the point of view of maximum likelihood estimation to infer these parameters, this is one technique of doing this, where you are going to take the log likelihood of this PMF. We're going to minimize a function, since a lot of our tools for optimization are posed as minimization tools. And so we're going to take the negative of the log likelihood, and it turns into this problem right here, that we have a function of x and m. We don't have to actually minimize this function. We can minimize the function that just has the parameters m in it and drop all the terms that are constant. And so often we're just looking at this functional here. And then there's some other requirements associated with this loss function that you didn't have before. Yeah. Okay, so this I, because we're working with tensors, as Tammy is pointing out, is really a multi-index. So it's not just a single index of I, but it's the full I, J, K in the ABC three-way tensor that she was talking about before. In this case, it's a multi-index. Whenever we see these individual entries, m sub I or x sub I, it's really on a multi-index. And like I said before, it's the identity link, so the expectation of this random variable I is our parameter m. Okay, so when we look at the tensor toolbox, there's a specific method for doing this type of data fitting for tensor decompositions using the CP model. It's called CP APR, or alternating Poisson regression. This was done a long time ago, almost a decade ago, by Tammy and Eric Chi, with some more advanced optimization methods by Sammy Hansen and Todd Plantenga and Tammy as well. So if we wanted to do this in general, this would take a long time. For each type of loss function, we would have to go through this same process over and over. So this is what motivated the idea of generalizing it to more general loss functions and not just go one at a time and try to understand how do we extend CP for each type of data that we're working with. So GCP can take lots of different loss functions. The ones that are available today in the MATLAB Tensor Toolbox range from working with real valued data like Gaussian distribution assumptions and the Gaussian loss function to these count data that I talked about. There are several for binary data, depending on the types of assumptions that you have of your data, some non-negative real value data, and some more advanced loss functions that are parametrized as well. So the beta divergence or the Huber loss or the negative binomial. So not only can we work with single parameter loss functions like you saw in the Poisson and the before, but you can actually work with multi-parameter as long as you're choosing only an instance of the family using a parameterization. Okay. Yes.
So this is about the distribution of the data stored in the tensor.
That's right, in X. So if we have some assumption of where X came from. Right.
How about, say, along one axis it's Gaussian and along the other it's Poisson?
Yeah, so this question is, that was asked, this question that was asked is about, is the distribution that we're talking about the data X? And the answer is yes. And then the question was, can we have along one dimension an assumption that the data is of one type, say Poisson, and in another direction of another type, say binary or Gaussian? At the moment, we do not address that. And so all of the distributions are assumed to be, all of the data are assumed to coming from the same distributional family, but they all have a different parameter. And that's what we're trying to infer with this maximum likelihood estimation.
Could we please ask the questions into the microphone? This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So an advanced option that you have with GCP is that you actually can define your own loss functions. And the requirement there is that you have to define both the function as well as the gradient. For all of our optimization methods, as Tammy had brought up before, working with the gradients is really easy with CP, so we've made that assumption when working with CP as well, is that you have to provide both the function value and the gradient. And there is an example that you can look at in the documentation for GCP op. So this loss function and gradient computation, pretty straightforward with respect to what Tammy had presented for computing the gradients for the CP opt calculation. The difference here is that instead of using a specific form, the least squares form, or the sum of squares form, we have this function f, and now we have to take the gradient with respect to that. And the nice thing is that the form of the gradient takes on the form of this matricized tensor times Catu-Rao product that Tammy said is already available in the MATLAB Tensor Toolbox and has been optimized. And so we can benefit from all of the work for CP now with the generalized CP for general functions. First, we compute this gradient, and then we compute using the MTTKRP. But the challenge here is that this is really expensive. This part can be very expensive. So what can we do to solve these problems? First, we have multiple methods for doing the optimization. A faster limited memory quasi-Newton method with bound constraints. So this would help with our Poisson case if we had dense data. If we have sparse data though, and it's really large, we may not want to use that type of method for our data. So there are some stochastic gradient methods as well. A vanilla version, a version based on momentum called ATOM, and then an adaptive gradient method called ADAGRAD. And the default for dense data is this limited memory LBFGS quasi-Newton method, but for the sparse tensor data, the default is ATOM. So if you don't specify the optimizer, these defaults will come into play. When you look at the stochastic methods, they're doing some sampling on the amount of data that you are using to estimate the gradient at each of the iterations within an epoch. And so you have to specify more information in order to run these optimizers. Specifically, you have to design or define how you do the sampling and how much sampling is actually used in the computation. So there's more emphasis or more work that's required of the user, but in general, this will help us scale up to much larger problems. So the different kinds of sampling methods that are here are uniform and stratified when we're working with the function value estimation, and then when we're working with gradient, the gradient sampling, you can use uniform or stratified or semi-stratified, and the references here, you can look at what are the differences between these different methods. We're only going to be working with one to see what the differences are and what the impact is of using these different types, but if you want more information, you can go into these references and find more information about the differences between the different sampling methods. And again, like with the function value and the gradient that you want to use, you can also create and use your own optimizer. that can either use sampling or not sampling, but you can define your own optimization routines. As we've seen at this conference, there have been a lot of ideas about how to solve these low-rank tensor decomposition methods. If you come up with something that you think would be useful, you can implement your own, and there are some instructions on how to do that in the documentation. So how do you get to the documentation? For GCP opt, you can just do in the command line for MATLAB, you can look for help GCP opt. It's a little bit more complicated if you want to get more advanced information about the documentation. First you type docs GCP opt, and then at the bottom of that documentation page, you can click on this link for a documentation page, and it comes to the full documentation page that you see on the bottom right. This is where all of the information is. Not all of it is in the help that comes in the command line. If you want more information, you can go to this documentation page. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this example for GCP that that you have access to in the lab, called the Chicago crime data. It's a 4-way tensor of counts, and so we don't want to use the Gaussian distribution assumption, but use a different loss function for this. It's not too big, but it's big enough where it will actually take some time to run lots and lots of iterations of the optimizer. Maybe not for here, but offline you can do that. We have some smaller data sets, but I wanted to point this one out because it's large, but also using count data. You'll be using a different data set called Enron data. I'll talk a little bit about that. The point of using this one is that a lot of times you might look at the factors that come out of the CP decomposition in a way that's one of those rank 1 tensors by rank 1 tensor. So each row of this is one of these fibers or the columns of the factor matrices, just plotted for each one of the rank 1 tensors on each of these rows. So this shows you how you can do this for the Chicago crime data, and you can start to analyze this data this way. Now, this is the typical way that you would start with the output of a CP model, but with this data, we have a lot more information. There's geolocation associated with the neighborhoods associated with areas of Chicago in which these crimes are taking place. That's the neighborhood information that's in the 3rd column here. So instead of looking at it just as a linearization of it with an index value, you can actually take into account more information. I'm going to move on to this one, more information, and map it into the actual areas in a map. So you can download this information from the City of Chicago's public website, and then map the neighborhoods and the results of this GCP model onto a domain-specific visualization. So if you want to, for your data, if you have a way to visualize your data, whether it's some kind of scientific data or maybe like this, geolocation data, you can take the factors that come out of the GCP models and use more specific visualizations than just those dot plots or scatter plots that you see from the previous slides. And when we look at this, there's a way that you can run this code so that you can look at one component at a time, or one of these rank 1 tensors at a time. If we look at 1 versus 2, you can see that it's different parts of Chicago, different neighborhoods that have high concentration of crimes at different times, different patterns in the day through hours, and then different times over the several years of data that has been collected for this. So this is a way that you can look at how it represents some meaning in your application as well. Okay, so the 3 labs that we're going to play around with for generalized CP, one is an artificial data set that's created with a tool that comes with the Tensor Toolbox for creating binary data. And then you want to use a different loss function for fitting that data and then visualize it in a couple of different ways. This Enron email data set, so several years ago, Enron was under investigation for securities fraud, and all of the emails were released associated with people in that company as part of the investigation. People have been curating this data over time. This is a smaller subset of the data that has been labeled with external information, and so the purpose of this is to, one, do a low-rank decomposition, but then also use side information to label the information that you get out of the CP decomposition in order to help with your interpretation. So you'll see with and without this labeled data being used as part of the visualization. And then this bonus is this Chicago data set where you'll be able to actually do the decomposition and then visualize using these tools that are domain specific. Again, all the data is here if you don't have it already, or pointers to the data are here if you don't have it already. And if you want more information about any of these 3 data sets, then you can go to the individual GitHub data repositories and look at the information as part of the README. And at that, I think we're ready to move on to the last lab. And this lab, if you want to catch up with other ones, that's fine as well. But here, this gives you an opportunity to work with this generalized version. Are there any questions before we move into the lab about this? I know it's a high-level overview and mostly focused towards giving you the right tools to start working on the labs, but all the references here, you can go in and look at more detailed information about this, working with more generalized versions of CP as well.
So as folks are finishing up, I see you starting to dribble out. If you want to kind of go up to the microphone and just say your interest in tensors, even if it's just to learn more, but if you have applications, we'd be really interested to hear. And if you don't want to go to the microphone, you could just, let us know some other way. And also, we definitely want to hear feedback, what worked, what didn't work. And this is definitely, we'll probably recycle this again. And so we'd love to hear from you. And there was a question about how long the labs will stay up. And at least for a little while, you'll have plenty of time to get them down. Until I am wondering what it is, they'll probably stay up. So. Also, if you have any last questions, there was one I think earlier, I said save it for the end.
Hey, I guess I should also answer your first question, which is, I'm David Hong, and Tammy opened my eyes to tensor decompositions, and they're very cool and fun, I think, and have a lot of cool structure and problems. So I guess that's my interest. And then, the question that I was talking with someone earlier, and you said to save, I think, was about thoughts on when to choose each of these different decompositions.
Right, and does anyone have any specific tensors they kind of have in mind and they're wondering which decomposition to use? Yeah, can you?
So I have a question. I don't know if anyone else is wondering this, but I wonder how the QR and S are chosen in HOSVD. Maybe, but I'm not sure if this is the right question to answer right now.
No, that's great. All right, so I'll since we didn't get to answer the other one, I'm gonna do that, and then I'm gonna do that.
Okay.
So the how to pick between CP and Tucker, it's a choice. My general recommendation is that Tucker is usually most useful for compressing data, and that's because it's non-unique. So the U, V, and W that you get out are not necessarily the same. You have some way of rotating them, so it can cause confusion in interpretation. So it's super useful for compression. And one of the nice things about these Tucker methods is you can actually say, I need to compress it as much as I can, but I can't compress it. I can only lose so much information. So you can actually specify the error threshold, and we can actually figure out the Tucker ranks that will give you that exact error. So it's kind of nice because you have a lot of control over how much error you introduce by compression. So you can say, I either want to compress 100 times and I don't care what the error is. You can say, I need the error to stay within this threshold, and it will tell you the ranks. So that kind of answers your question, Zhao. Number 2 is, how do you pick the ranks? You can actually tell us what error you're willing to tolerate, and we'll find you the smallest possible ranks we can while respecting your error tolerance. It won't go above that specified error tolerance. And it's actually very easy to do. It's no extra work, turns out. And then you use CP often when you want to do interpretation and stare at the factors. So That's sort of when I use that. But there are many people who have used CP for compression or used Tucker for interpretation. And so, you know, get creative. But those are the sort of the rules of thumb for that. Anybody else brave enough to give us some comments or questions?
Hi, my name's Nicole. I work on operator inference, and I'm interested in tensors because I want to more or less understand more what I gain or lose by going from like vectorized tensors to real tensors. And I was wondering, except for the compression outside of that field, what are properties that kind of get generalized from matrices that we know to tensors, like eigenvalue decompositions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what are properties that get generalized? Not very many. That's sort of the interesting thing. So I don't know of an eigenvalue decomposition for a tensor, for example. We have a notion of tensor eigenvalues, several different kinds of tensor eigenvalues, as a matter of fact, but you can't combine those to create a decomposition. At least I don't know how to. So it's kind of a bit frustrating, but also leaves a lot of doors open. One thing that I actually usually say is that non-negative matrix factorization has a lot of the same problems as tensor factorization. It's NP hard to compute the rank. It's challenging to compute. And so sometimes SVD is just like strangely nice. Most other matrix factorizations aren't as nice, and CP sort of goes in the bucket with everything except SVD. Hopefully that helps a little bit. Thought I saw somebody else about to get up.
I just had a comment, and I'm not sure about this, but isn't it possible to first compress the data using the Tucker decomposition and then do CP decomposition on G, and you get the C decomposition of the first model for free or something like this?
And who are you?
I'm João Pereira from IMPA. Yeah.
Thank you. So absolutely, thanks for pointing that out. So if you have really big data and you want to do CP on it and it's dense, you can do this nifty thing where you first apply Tucker and then you get a smaller tensor. You apply CP just to the core, and then you can actually kind of combine those two and get the CP decomposition of that full big tensor. And it has a name, it's called CANDELINC, Candelink, or Candicomp with linear constraints. We have really weird names in the tensor world. But it's a very useful method. So yeah, you can even combine these. All right, Gray, I wanted to see if you had any comments in our last couple minutes. If you're not in a breakout room.
We came back. Maybe there was one question that we were discussing in the breakout room for GCP, and that is, what benefit do you get out of using the more accurate loss function for your data? Can you tell if you sort of blindly use the L2 loss function that you get bad results?
All right, so if I understand the question is, what's the benefit of using an alternate loss function? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hesitating because it's kind of a long story. You know, the L2 is sort of assumes the data is Gaussian. If you have a sum of random variables, it defaults to Gaussian. It eventually converges to a Gaussian, so it's often a safe assumption to use that. But we have found in many of our real world data sets that it doesn't seem to describe the data well when we look at the factors. So we were kind of motivated by being stuck with factorizations that weren't sensible to us. And so we kind of backed out, well, what do we do with this count data? We had a lot of examples of data with data tensors that were counts and mostly zero. And it's very hard to describe those data. And so we actually started off I was actually looking to generate artificial data sets and ended up realizing that we can't generate artificial data sets because they don't make sense for least squares loss. And that ended up leading to figuring out alternate loss functions, such as assuming the data is count data and is generated by a Poisson distribution, and then each element potentially has a different mean that it's associated with, and those means come from this multilinear expression. I don't know if that completely answers it, but
That's
happy
great.
to talk more offline.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Danny Dunleavy. I just have one other example where it does matter. If your data is of different orders of magnitude, often you might try to do some pre-scaling to get them all into the same ranges of data. That would usually break some of the relationships of data that's not Gaussian data. And so we don't have to do that because we can use something like a Poisson distribution for count data when you have both low and high count data in your tensor without having to destroy that structure by scaling. So when the magnitudes of your data are very large but don't follow Gaussian distributions, that's another reason why you would want to use these alternative loss functions.
And also, I often recommend to just play around with different loss functions and see how it goes. We do a lot of that in the paper. You see some examples. Great. Well, I want to thank you all for being participants today, very active participants, and for really working hard on those labs. And please let us know if you have additional feedback, ideas for other activities we could include and for future iterations of this. And thanks so much for attending today. And thank you, by the way, to our Genius Bar, Jeremy and Brett, and thanks to my collaborators on this workshop, Danny and Gray.